So thank you everyone for joining. We're very excited about this event, about the fact that you are here. As you all know, we are launching the 10% for All campaign. And for the next hour and a half, we will speak not only about the campaign itself, but also about the content, the themes that come up from it. And I'll start just by presenting a bit, what is this campaign? How has it came to be so far. I'll just present myself. My name is Sahar Vardi. I work coordinating this 10% campaign together with Aida Rawa that you will hear from later. And this is a coalition of many different organizations, and we will soon speak about how it came to be and what it looks like today. You are very welcome to introduce yourself also in the chat box and generally write things throughout. Questions that you have, things of the sort. We will have times for questions and answers later. So that is just for kind of the housekeeping. But we would like to just dive in and speak a bit about the campaign and the idea behind it. So I'm just going to share my screen. Apologize for that. This is a historical document that I wanted to maybe start with, so I'm just going to read it out and then ask people in the chat box to write who you think wrote this and in what year. I took out the year, in what context, what year. Any guess is a good guess, but this says an effective means of achieving that goal, and that goal was shifting funds to peaceful purposes, would be to reduce the military budget of the permanent members of the Security Council, the state whose military spending is heaviest, and to earmark a certain part of the funds thus saved for assistance to developing countries. This reduction could amount to 10% of the military budget for a specific year. Part of the funds obtained in this manner, let us say 10%, could be used to assist developing countries. Now, for me, looking at different initiatives throughout history and periods of time where people said, let's try to demilitarize and let's try to reduce military spending globally, looking at part of the history was very important. So I will do a spoiler here as to who it was for everyone guessing on the chat. But this was written by the Soviet Union to the General Secretary of the UN for a resolution in 1973, trying to push for such a reduction specifically for the Security Council members. Now, if we hear about this now, it seems like it doesn't make sense. It sounds almost like science fiction. And I think it is important to understand that at this point in history, at a point in history that was one of the most militarized, with obviously the Soviet Union and the US in not just a conflict, but a potential for a nuclear conflict that swept the entire world at probably the kind of the heart of the arms race as we know it. And yet in the middle of that, there was an actual push both by the Soviet Union, but including very serious conversations within US administrations for a global cut in military spending. And this were conversations that were happening for a very long time. And there was a fair chance it could have happened. Now, we all know history, we all know it didn't, but I did want to start with this just to say that this is not fantasy, that this is not science fiction, that this is something that if enough people believe can be a reality and push for, if we decide that it can be a reality and push for, then it is a possibility. Continuing with that history, obviously there have been a lot of different groups and campaigns pushing for things of the sort throughout history. And most recently, just during COVID, there were a group of over 50 Nobel laureates that called for a 2% cut over 5 years if we do the math, that is a 10% cut. And they did the math, and they saw what could be done with this money. And a lot of it was about climate relief at the time. COVID relief. We all remember the economic expenses that also had, showing how the climate crisis, extreme poverty, and issues of the pandemic could have been solved with this kind of initiative. This is far from being the only one. There is a global campaign for cutting military spending that has been a coalition of organizations for many years, and we know a lot of people have been working on this. And what we are trying to do here today is put more energy into that and launch a campaign that is going to be calling for that globally. These are just some of the organizations that are on board on different levels to this new campaign, and I think it is important to kind of see the three focuses that we have on this campaign. When we look at of this 10%, we're talking about 10% cut of military spending. That's one part of it. We're talking about a 10% investment in humanity, in positive things, and we're talking about reframing security as part of that. And all of those things together are the core messaging. And I think seeing who some of the partners of this campaign are, who's in this coalition now, and the idea is for this coalition to grow, really reflects that, because different organizations are coming from different social justice causes. And you can see climate organization, and you can see workers' organizations, and you can see organizations or feminist organizations, ones that come from the peace world. And all of these are coming together, both because militarization affects and hurts all of these populations and all of these social justice causes, as we all know, and speakers will be speaking about this a lot throughout the day, but also because this 10% could be helping in all of these things, could be solving a lot of the global problems that we look at today. I will also say 10% is a nice, catchy number, but it is a beginning. It's an aspiration that can continue to grow. And for that, we will later on read the entire call that was agreed upon by the coalition. But just to give you a bit of a taste of what this call is actually calling for. So starting just with the numbers of what does military spending look like today. And in 2024, last year, global military spending was $2.7 trillion, right? That is the equivalent of South Africa, Canada, Brazil, and India's entire budgets combined. And the spike that we've seen of 9.4% increase from 2023 is the highest we have on record. And so we propose a simple yet transformative approach, a coordinated global 10% reduction in military expenditure. This is about reframing national security rather than weakening it. We advocate for a strategic approach, building on regional and multilateral treaties on the way to a global treaty, drawing inspiration from successful models like the one of the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties, which included agreements across Latin America, the Caribbean, Oceania, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central Asia. And we call not only for the divestment from military spending, but also investment in our future, locally and globally. Our call for allocating a percentage of each country's spending to global priorities seeks to address the inherent inequality between nations that contribute heavily to the global militarism and those who contribute far less. Now, these are just different parts of the entire call that I tried to put together just to show what this call really talks about, which is both the reduction, what can be done with this reduction, an understanding that we need to also be speaking about the inequality of militarization globally, and we will speak about it throughout the day, and also understanding that this strategy is not all or nothing, and that there are a lot of milestones that we can be calling for and building on in the process. On that note, a lot of why we are doing this event that is very much geared towards civil society organizations that we see as potential partners is really to widen this conversation and to have you join us in different ways. So on the chat there will be the website. You can just click a button and join us in that way. There are both ways for individuals, but also for organizations. And at the very end of this webinar, we will go a bit more in depth into how you can join, what are different ways of being involved. But just for those of you who won't be able to stay until the end, I wanted to already pitch this at this point. I'm not going to continue to speak too much because we have a very full roster of speakers speaking to us about fascinating different subjects that all have to do with both militarization, what is done with military spendings, but also what could be done and what those funds could alternatively be doing. To save time, I'm going to now introduce all of our speakers, and then later on, you will hear from them and have an opportunity for questions. I will just say we are doing the questions at the end of all the presentations, so please either write the questions for yourself or write them in the chat. As we go, we will be looking at all of the questions, putting them all together, trying to combine as many as possible so that we have time to answer as many of your questions within this. For me, this is very exciting also to just see who the speakers are, again, coming from different social justice struggles, from different movements, from different places around the world, coming here together. So we will start with a presentation that looks at the climate aspects that will be from Adrián Martínez Blanco from La Ruta del Clima in Costa Rica, together with Patrick Hiller from the War Prevention Initiative. We will continue to be talking about borders militarization and migration issues with Aida Raumer from the 10% for All campaign, as well as Raza Shahan from the Sustainable Peace and Development Organization in Pakistan. Later on, Khulud El-Saidi, who is a Middle East peace practitioner, together with Mike Merriman Lotz from the American Friends Service Committee, are going to speak to us about the money aspects of this, about aid and international financial mechanisms. And then Andrea Castillo from La Liga Internacional de Mujeres por la Paz a la Liberación, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom from Colombia, will be speaking to us about the feminist aspects of these questions. And so on that note, I'm going to say, please, Patrick and Adrian, take us away.
Okay. Thank you, Sahar, for this introduction. I'm going to jump straight into it and talk about climate. Last year, the world hit a new record, not in climate action, but in military spending. And I use the term military spending, not defense spending, because we should question whether this really provides safety. And if you're curious about that language, wordsaboutwar.org has a really helpful language guide. In 2024, we spent 2.718 trillion on militaries, and that number can feel abstract. It is to me, until you realize it's more than the combined budgets of South Africa, Canada, Brazil, and India. Meanwhile, the planet burns. This is a global crisis. Militaries worldwide are massive polluters, burning fossil fuels, poisoning ecosystems, and driving carbon-intensive production. Now, if global militarism were a country, it would be the fourth largest greenhouse gas emitter. Now, I want to focus on the US military, the single largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases on Earth. So think about what that means. We have warplanes, guzzling jet fuel, tanks, ships, global deployments, hundreds of overseas bases, weapons factories, and global supply chains. So this isn't a side issue in climate change. It's central to the climate emergency. Now, I live in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon, home to lush forests, salmon runs. Both are threatened by climate breakdown. I also live 130 miles from the Hanford site, where the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb was made. It is now the most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. There's still radioactive waste leaking from underground tanks. And nearby, I passed the Umatilla Chemical Depot, which once was home to 12% of the US's chemical weapons. And you see miles of bunker-like mounds that once held weapons of mass destruction. In Portland, where our organization is based, we see military presence in everyday ways. In a few days, the city will host Fleet Week, welcoming Navy ships into port. And the Port of Portland is hosting right now the USNS Bob Hope, a massive Navy cargo ship. And to put that into perspective, if you drive a typical car daily, it would take you 25 years, over 25 years, to burn the amount of fuel that ship uses in one day at sea. So this isn't just symbolic. This is real, it's daily, and it's just a glimpse into the scale of destruction we normalize. So if we're serious about staying within planetary boundaries, we must confront the environmental footprint of war. And we must shift investment, not as charity, but as a life-saving strategy. And that's why this campaign matters. And, we're not asking for the moon, just 10%. And that would save us 271 billion every year. With that, we could fund half the climate finance promised to the global south. We could build climate resilient infrastructure to protect frontline communities. We could provide clean drinking water to everyone on Earth. We could fund early warning systems for climate vulnerable regions. We could support a just transition for fossil fuel workers. So this isn't just hope, it's policy made possible by reallocating resources. So the real question is, can we afford not to? If we're serious about climate justice, about protecting people, about protecting the planet, we must confront militarism. So let's take 10% from destruction and give it to life. Thank you. And I'll pass it on to my colleague Adrian.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Adrian Martinez, and we work on Central America on loss and damage in frontline communities. And over the past 10 years, we have seen how climate finance never arrives. And when we talk about climate change, this is very important because the resources that are needed to address loss and damage and to address climate impacts are paid by the most vulnerable. And in Central America, as in many other communities, militarism has been one of those things that has increased vulnerability. And when you think about climate, you have to think on one side emissions. And for example, emissions of the military are not taken on account within the Paris Agreement, are not accounted for. Nobody is held responsible for them. But also militarization is one of those things that drive vulnerability, that make people and communities more susceptible to loss and damage, to suffering, to seeing their loved ones have to leave their communities because there is no future, to face this existential threat that is making people have no water, have no food, lose their land, lose their community, and then have to face all on their own. And if we see how much money is needed for climate change, as Patrick said, just with 10%, we could even pay twice the amount that was pledged in the last COP. So it is extremely significant. And if you see how much money is needed for loss and damage, for these communities to have the means to maintain their lives and have human dignity, it is an amount that could be covered. Right now, the pledge for the whole world on money for loss and damage is only for 741 million. And this is not a per year amount. That's just the amount there is. If we if we start moving money from militarism to investing on security, investing on security of society's well-being, on the future of our communities, we could have a significant change in the lives of people. We could improve the reasons why it is worth to remain in a territory and not have to move. We could ensure human rights, and we could start transforming what we have not seen the past 30 years, which is an economy based on high carbon emissions, built on also on the use of military as an excuse to control and suppress the communities that are being impacted by climate change. So I think this is an extremely important opportunity, because each time that we're faced with actual crisis, with actual things that are destroying the lives of people like climate change, we're found that there is no money. But if we see the trillions that are invested in militarism, we know there is money, there is resources. There is only an issue of allocating correctly the resources. And as Patrick said, it's only 10%. It is a insignificant amount for if you put it in light of the amount of investment and use of resources that is done on the military. But if you contrast that with what is actually given to address those things that are critical for life to go on, it is a complete disproportional imbalance, and the inequity of it will not ensure us a future. So security and well-being of people has to be aligned with values of what builds community, what builds development, what builds well-being. And militarism in our communities have built destruction, persecution, violence, murders, and an unstable economy and community. That does not resolve. And as a Costa Rican, I know that there is a chance if we rearrange our investments towards community efforts, towards the development of culture, of society, of the economy. And if we rethink what builds security, what makes us stable, what ensures a future, investing on people is always has been proven, at least in my country and in many others, that is the correct choice. And we have not seen in the huge amounts of investment towards the military and distracting resources from other critical areas such as climate, an improvement in our way of life. If not, what we actually seen is a complete distrust on what we can expect for the future and in a more unstable world. So I urge you to support this 10% campaign. There is possibility to draw resources, and there is a possibility to actually construct a future that is according to what we value, which is life, which is our community, which is our land. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I will pick up from here and talk about another aspect of militarization, which is the link between militarization, borders, and migration. Let me just share my screen. Is that working? Not yet.
Now it's working.
Perfect. Okay, so of course, one other link or one obvious link between militarization and borders is that, or militarization and movement, is that militarism itself and the consequences of arms exports from the EU, the US, other countries are a key reason why people choose to or have to move in the first place. And so the direct impact of militarism creates the conditions which make life unbearable and create displacement within and across borders. And I'm sure that you don't necessarily need a reminder of this, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states in Article 13 that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and that everyone has the right to leave any country, including their own, and also to return to their country. This human right is not honored, and what we see instead is a criminalization of movement and a militarization of borders, even in borderlands where there is no armed conflict as such. So what the previous presentation already touched upon is that border control has become a key building block of the discourse on militarized security. And militarism is presented as a solution when it is the cause of displacement and harm. This leads to, for example, the EU spending 44 billion euros of public funds until 2027 which have been allocated to security and defense purposes, and of which 5.6 billion euros go to Frontex directly. On top of that, there's an additional aid budget which is being redirected towards border management also, which means a de facto externalization of borders to countries outside of the EU. And this, of course, is a parallel development that we can also observe in the United States, and that is directly infringing upon the human right to freedom of movement in the name of security. So the violence that movement and mobility is dealt with is a direct consequence of a militaristic logic, where dividing persons into binaries of us and them, belonging and not belonging, productive and unproductive, allows for the justification of human rights violations, violent pushbacks in the Mediterranean Sea, and detention in the name of security. And I have added the number here. Over the past 10 years, 35,000 people have died trying to reach Europe or disappeared. Of course, the human cost of this border making is known to those enforcing these type of borders, because if you look at, for example, the central role that the Irish border took in the discourse on Brexit negotiations, it was central and clear that borders that are violently imposed create not more but less peace and reproduce historical harm, disrupt economic exchange, and disrupt livelihoods, ecosystems, food systems, as well as destroying and separating families. So another thing I'd like to add here is that beyond human rights not being enforced in practice right now, as a result of a militarized logic, which this campaign is trying to break, there's also a significant amount of people that don't even theoretically, in theory, have anywhere to turn to for their rights to be enforced. So in particular, people that are displaced because of the impact of the climate crisis, which currently is completely underinvested in, cannot be recognized as refugees, as well as 15 million stateless people worldwide that are denied even the right to have rights. So for example, along the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where there's an increasing military presence and a wall being built, alongside a weekly deportation of up to 10,000 persons, it goes along, this development goes alongside the revoking of citizenship of 130,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent, de facto making them stateless, and so making them more vulnerable to detention, deportation, and violent law enforcement. So this just to show that these ethno-nationalistic policies, which fuel racism and fear of the other, have also historically fueled violence and massacres, therefore creating human insecurity rather than security. So beyond this policy of militarizing borders in the name of protection from migration, borders themselves also have been technologies of militarization and war. They are not only a response, a policy response to migration, but borders and border making in history are often intrinsically linked to militarism, to colonialism, and a carceral logic. So they are not natural. They have been set up in mostly costly and violent processes and now are maintained in the same costly and violent manner, or by externalizing violence to other countries. And especially where societies are becoming more militarized internally, this is always visible also in the militarization of the borders they are upholding. And in the worst case, borders are actively used in warfare, as we see in the case of the mass starvation of the population in Gaza right now, where border management has become a technology of genocide. So I would like to invite Raza to speak on the specific regional context of South Asia.
Thank you so much, Ida. And it's a pleasure to speak on behalf of the 10% campaign. My name is Radha Shahan, and I represent Sustainable peace and development organization, which is a civil society, peace-oriented organization based in Pakistan. As I have mentioned that different regions have different dynamics related to militarization. So here I would like to highlight two examples, one that of the Afghanistan and the other which is related to the India-Pakistan border, or specifically the line of control in Kashmir region. I hope many of you would be aware of the Afghanistan conflict, which started in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And then there was this proxy war in which the long Afghan border, which is almost 2,600 kilometers of border, was specifically used to supply weapons, ammunitions, including even Stinger missiles to the jihadi groups which were created during those times. I remember, since I was living along the border at that time, that hundreds of jihadi camps were established. And it was basically a Cold War between the US and the USSR. And religion, in fact, was misused to wage jihad against Russia, against the former Soviet Union. And it is estimated that every day 60 to 70 trucks full of US weapons, even weapons was bought from China, from other regions of the world, and they were crossing the Afghan border, and those weapons were supplied to the Mujahideen, which were created to fight their jihad against the former Soviet Union. During that time, one of the other kind of significant impact was on the radicalization of youth. Like even the curriculum was taught, and the curriculum was even coming from the universities in US, like the University of Nebraska and other institutions. And they were actually radicalizing youth to fight that holy war and jihad. So now, like for the last 40, 50 years, such a radicalization has taken place, which is unimaginable and so difficult to control. And when the Afghan war ended in 1989, and then the Soviet Union disintegrated, there was then other, the Central Asian republics came in existence. The internal insurgencies started inside Afghanistan as militarization was promoted. Like there was huge caches of arms which came in the hands of different groups, different jihadi groups. So then it was not like a religious war. It is a war for power. It was a war to get government between different ethnic groups inside Afghanistan. And it was even more worse than the Soviet war. Then 9/11 happened. And again, a new scenario started. And those jihadis groups and those Taliban leaders, which were honored as kind of like freedom fighters, they were again labeled as terrorists. And again, the NATO forces and the ISAF forces started to enter Afghanistan. And then a 20 years long war again started again against the same people who in the past were supported by the West, by many regional countries, including Pakistan, and then they were labeled as terrorists, and the war against terrorism started. And I hope you would be aware that what happened in August 2021, that all of a sudden the Taliban came again inside Kabul. They occupied Kabul. And then the US forces and NATO forces were trying to leave Afghanistan in a very hectic way. And I hope you have seen pictures of the planes which were transporting the US military personnel, that even civilians were hanging on those planes. And when they flew, so many civilians came down and they died during that during that time. So Just to give
Raza,
you,
I'm going to have to
yes.
rush because we are short on time. I already skipped to the picture on Kashmir. Can you shortly summarize the conflict or the issues of the border population and the situation of militarization of the Kashmiri region, which is the most
Okay, so
militarized place in the world?
that is relevant to that. So I was just telling to you that this 2,600 kilometer border, how it was militarized and how it was used in Afghanistan. So coming to Kashmir, uh, 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 many of you would be aware that communities living along the line of control between India and Pakistan are suffering the most. Because it is a disputed territories after the partition in 1947. When the Indian subcontinent was break down after the Britishers left, and it is one of the most militarized places on earth. The UN has passed multiple resolutions for free and impartial plebiscite to determine the will of the people of Kashmir. But the plebiscite envisioned in the resolution was never held. And you have seen the recent conflicts between Pakistan and India have further aggravated the situation. So if you go through some other pictures, I would go to you can see that this beautiful valley of Kashmir, which is so natural, so beautiful in the context of climate, in the context of natural resources, and has been a hell for the local populations. There are constant displacements of people from the line of control. Line of control is actually not a permanent border. It is just a line of control between India and Pakistan because it is a disputed territory. And there are millions of people, millions of landmines have been planted along the line of control, both by India and Pakistan. And every day you will be seeing that people will be migrating from those areas. They have lost economic opportunities, livelihood. And I would like to mention here that South Asia is one of the most populous regions in the world with an estimated population of 2 billion people. It is the most densely populated region, which is about 1/4 of the total world population. There is a dire need to resolve the border disputes, build trust and cooperation, and get the advantage of the most resourceful region in terms of its land, people, natural resources. And I appreciate the 10% campaign, which is like very relevant to in today's world, that the people who were living for centuries together, like the India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, it was one country, are now so much divided. It is easy for us to go to Europe, but it is so difficult for us to go to India, and same is for the people of India. So we should strive for regional peace and regional integration. So for that, I'm thankful to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raza. And I think that this is the opportunity of the campaign as well. So instead of using borders as technologies of militarization, we want to reinforce our work across and beyond borders. And there are networks of shared humanity and solidarity, as well as care that have long existed along the Mediterranean Sea and across the Pacific Islands, across the Black Atlantic. And it's these networks that have allowed for sustainable forms of living together, economic development through remittances, cultural connections, and scientific exchange, as well as caring for the planet. So this to us is what creates true human security. So we propose to redirect this funding towards those populations that are most affected by militarism, most affected by the violence of extractivism and the climate crisis. And a lot of these populations will be peoples living in borderlands. It is them who wear the brunt of ethno-nationalistic tendencies, pushing for further militarization. So we are aiming to fund the work that organizations defending the human right to move, but also working on the human rights to remain and to return. We are looking to support those organizations in their work. Search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean need to be funded rather than criminalized. Human security in borderlands can be supported by upholding food systems, by developing them further, by allowing for the safe crossing of borders to allow for exchange and trade and secure livelihoods. And we need to push for diplomacy where borders are sites of violence and historical injustice. as well as advocating for the autonomy of border populations to care for the land that nurtures them. Thank you.
Thank you, Aida. Thank you, Raza. And before we go to more exploring the non-militarized mechanisms of global financing, I would like to highlight some numbers and statistics that could really share and give us an information about the aid, where it goes. As my colleagues were talking about the climate change and how much money is spending on make the situation worse than is it, and also about the borders and the technologies. Here, if I will start with going through some kind of numbers and statistics that reflect military spending in the MENA region and Africa. And I want to highlight, when I said Africa, it's also some of the North African countries are involving here. And then I can go through the social spending and the needs. We finalize it with the foreign aid and the shift towards more security-driven aid before we see how we can have, what is the impact on this and how we can really shift that. If you're talking about the MENA region, in 2023, the global military spending reached a record high of 2.443 trillion, making a 6.8 increase from the previous year. In the Middle East, when we are talking about one of the unbreasted regions in the world, we can see that the estimated growth in military spending in 2023 was 9%, which is 12% higher than in 2022, making the region with the highest growth in 2023, with 30% of the arms exported globally being important to the countries in the region. And even in the last 10 years, with the war, also the last 5 years, the war in Ukraine, still the increase on the military expenditure, if we see in this graph, comparing between the Middle East and Eastern Europe, Middle East is taken like going higher than Eastern Europe. On the other side, we can see the social spending, development goals, and the needs and the investment. Social spending in the MENA region on health, education, welfare, and still remain below the international benchmarks. Only 25% of the countries in the region are on track to achieve the hunger reduction goal in 2030. And only 15 of the countries in the region are on the track of meeting the SDGs goals on decent work and sustained employment. Then we are talking about like Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and Mauritania are all deteriorating instead of reversing. And on the other hand, if we see the foreign aid, military aid versus the peace building and development, the region has steadily received the most foreign aid, the most US foreign aid, more than of all Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America combined. Israel, Iraq, Egypt, and Iraq and Jordan are the main beneficiaries of these funds. Most of this assistance are military aid. In Israel, 100% of the US aid is military aid, while in Jordan, almost 30% of the aid is directed to military aid. In Egypt, 90% of the US foreign aid is a military aid. While we can see that the EU is providing more aid towards humanitarian and development aid than directed for military purposes. EU in Yemen was providing humanitarian aid, and Syria also. The humanitarian aid from the EU was more rather than the military aid. On the other side, if we can see the military spending in Africa, Africa's total military expenditure was around 51.6 billion in 2023. Sub-Saharan Africa military spending and defense, as what Patrick was saying, like there's different terminologies here. The budget in 2021 was 20.9 billion US dollars, with a 14 point or almost 15% increase from 2022. And the spending was more increase on the facing insecurities regions like Sahel and Horn of Africa, And the total government military spending here was 6.8 in 40 countries. And this is the highest value was in Somalia. And this is the key spenders, as I said, also including some kind of like countries on North Africa, like Egypt and Algeria. On the other side, if we see the social spending, development goals and needs in Africa and the investment happening, Africa faces 184 billion annual financing gap to meet the SDGs by 2030. And it's only receiving 30%, 35% of the global official development assistance, like roughly 70% of its needs per year. And the priorities, it's the same, including health, education, infrastructure, and also employment and welfare. On the other hand, if we see, have been a shift towards security-driven aid, where it is more concentrated, as what Ida was saying earlier, was more concentrated on border protection, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism. And then we can see that the EU fund, as the numbers with Ida was mentioning earlier, it's also the EU was launched the trust funding for Africa, the emergency trust funding for Africa, 5 billion since 2015, only 5 billion since then, for the security, especially in North and West Africa. And the other side, we can see that also they are allocated more money for support operation and capacity building. One of the things, and also my colleague Mike will talk about like the US fund, we can see that in 2023, the US allocated substantial fund to various security assistance programs across Africa with peacekeeping operations, international control and line enforcement, and also foreign military financing. The new player in the ground is China, which China is now getting more putting hands on Africa in this year, in the beginning of this year, like we are talking about 3 months ago. China pledged 1 million wine, with a line, it's just like 136 million US aid, military aid to Africa, in addition to training of troops and police officers, and to support responses and standby forces focusing on counterterrorism and peacekeeping operations. And in September also, they only pledged 50 billion. If you see the numbers between what was pledged for the military support and what is pledged for aid over 3 years was 50 billion. And by this said, and also all the information my colleagues were saying, here we can see exactly what is Mike is going to tell us about the impact and investing on military and not in development. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Khulud. I'm Mike Merriman-Lotes. I'm the Just Peace Global Policy Director for the American Friends Service Committee. Khulud offered some of the numbers, and I'm going to talk about some of the effectiveness of aid. Investing in militarism and not development or peace building is both expensive and ineffective. In 2019, a group of US military leaders spoke out about the need to support development. And they noted that for every $1 that we spend on conflict prevention, the US saves $16 in response costs and for not using the military. There's clear evidence that shows that development assistance and conflict prevention programming decrease instability and violence in ways that military action cannot. One study carried out by Harvard between 2005 and 2014 found that countries that received the highest levels of health assistance enjoy near immediate results, not only in terms of health, but in terms of higher quality of governance, lower degrees of corruption, enhanced social cohesion, and more vibrant civil societies. The study concluded that there's a direct correlation between development aid, stability, and security in recipient locations. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody when people's needs are met, whether at a local, national, or international level. The key drivers of conflict, violence, and instability are taken away. And as Khulud pointed out, globally, we're investing less in development and more in militarism, even though the evidence shows that military investment does not have the same impact. One study that looked at the impact of US military funding in 174 countries found no evidence that US military aid contributes to increased local state capacity and no evidence that US military aid makes the US safer. And to the contrary, the study found that higher levels of military aid cause higher levels of anti-American violence in recipient countries. And as decades of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations demonstrate, military intervention and support do not do more to sustain conflict and violence than they do to resolve it. So we need a new path forward. And one part of blazing that new path involves, as this campaign is suggesting, a reconceptualization of the concept of security to understand that meeting human needs is a key factor in the security equation. We need to meet human needs. And another part of blazing that new path involves reassessing traditional international aid and development structures. As kind of I started out, the investment in development is a key part of improving safety and security, improving health, and we need to be uplifting the importance of development programming. But we also shouldn't be blind to many of its traditional failings. Too often, current international development structures and paradigms sustain dependency instead of promoting long-term development. They displace domestic resources. They're plagued with inefficiencies. They come with political and economic conditionalities that serve donor interests over the needs of beneficiaries, and they reinforce neo-colonial dominance of the global north. We don't want to feed into kind of right-wing current attacks on the international assistance, particularly at a time when the US is pulling back all of its funding from development and aid and peace building and putting that money towards increased militarism. But the destruction of USAID also provides an opportunity for rethinking aid structures and processes. And part of what we want to see in the 10% for all campaign, or part of what this campaign provides, is really a door for exploring what changes, exploring those changes through kind of a process of international dialogue and ideation that moves us forward in creating a global structure that channels military money away from militarism and towards where it's needed most. If we can channel money in that way, the impacts would be enormous. As was stated kind of earlier, a 10% reduction in global military spending would free up $270 billion annually, and that's enough to end world hunger and cover half of the required climate financing for the global south, with money left over to invest in healthcare, education, infrastructure, social welfare, and other programming. This campaign isn't just about cutting military spending to lower budgets. It's about shifting funding from militarism and war and towards addressing global needs like healthcare, education, infrastructure, green transitions, and climate change in sustainable ways. It's about challenging traditional notions of security and building new structures to address global needs that prioritize the needs of those who are set to be beneficiaries of that investment. And through global partnership, we hope to shift understandings of security while supporting the creation of new structures that address the root causes of problems. Hunger, poverty, inequality, and a lack of rights are forms of insecurity, but they're not forms of insecurity that can be addressed through more weapons. And we want to work together to seek better solutions for moving forward. And with that, I will turn it over to the next colleagues.
Hola, buenos días.
Good morning. Greetings to all of you from Colombia. Greeting. My name is Andrea Catilla, the Women for Freedom and Peace. I would like to share with you what have been the impact that militarism and it has a direct impact in the life of women, and in the communities they have been very precarious. And we start from the idea that everything we have talked and analyze the impact, direct impact on the climate, financing or funding, the borders, it has a differential impact. And you can see it from a perspective or a magnifying light that prioritizes certain aspects of the life of women. So we start with the idea of militarization. It not only depends on the weapons and armies and men that are armed, that geopolitical these places have become strategic, but all subordination of women and the normalization of violence as part of the conflict, in the to use women to by the means of war. So we start with the idea the struggle for the reduction of the money invested in militarism is a system based on dehumanization, is part of a feminist agenda, and we talked about this on feminism that is anti-militarism and that don't give its back to reality. Historically, women have lived in this way for many, many centuries. And to recognize historically who have been in the building, in the construction, in the peace agendas, and it has been all the struggles for feminism and the struggle by women. So we start from the idea that in authoritarianism and contexts that are authoritarian imposes binary schemes or regimes. So it's very binary as a perspective of the reality of life itself, and we generate some links, some bonds of power that put the women in a differential way and diversity in a differential way. So everything that represents diversity and everything, this becomes a danger or a jeopardy for women. And so the concepts of militarism and the deep right and ideologies in the right, the far right, women have been persecuted, especially the ones who follow ideals for the rights of the land, the rights to nature. And this persecution results in a direct impact in the life of women. And it is key to represent the sustenance of life and in the community, especially in war context and militarized contexts. Also within the authoritarian governments, we have a security model that is imposed that imbalances the protection of the nations, the protection and defense of the borders through the armed armies. So I have seen this historically, not globally, but in some countries in the north of the world, also with legal armies, they don't represent security, defense, or protection of the population. So it's on the contrary, is mainly the protection of private interest and interest that of the increase of capital. So we cannot talk about militarism or question militarism if we don't question other logics, other repressive, like being patriarchs. So these are practices that are strong and they are reinforced. And he put two examples and here the produce of this patriarchal and machism and misogynistic practices. This is military scenarios and the logic of promoting weaponed army, that there's a lot of resources to supply all the military associations to offer those productions, including in the inside of the armies, legal armies, and is a kind of masculinity that has been brought up through a military doctrine that is misogynistic and is violent for women. We know that military formation is based in discipline of the bodies and an ideology of control of established order. So in this established order, the masculine order has puts a priority in men, and women is not considered in this world. So the second example is to have the use of speech or an instrument of the speech using the direct use of weapons or in labor, like administrative work, of the use of women in this position, the use of this campaign. This doesn't represent necessarily the gender equality. Gender equality in armies, we need to demasculinize the concept, and in the struggles and the feminism have done in recent decades, looking for a balance and equality in a global world. So just as an example, we would like to show you a Colombian case. This is also is reused or replicated in other countries, in Latin American countries, and also in the African continent too, as we saw it some minutes ago, in the way we distribute in an unequal way the resources. For example, in Colombia, the defense ministry of the institution, militarized institution, for 1 year of its functioning, they destined 12.6 or more than that billion dollars for. So this is 432 millions are for the equality and ministry. So this is just reduced to $431 million compared to the defense budget. So on the other hand, all the implementation of the agreements, of peace agreements for 4 years, this is the same resource for the defense resource, only here in 1 year, what they spend in defense, 4 years for the peace agreements. Also the implementation of the care systems for women is in 10 years, has not been waged, let's say. So in different types of genres. So this is for 10 years, they destined $6 billion for 10 years. So here we see a clear and very imbalanced way of distributing the budget. And this is in Colombia, but it can represent in many other countries in the global south. So what is our bet here to create the agenda of equal, to be equal in for women? So this reduction of 10% would, because redistributing those resources have been destined for war, is a way. Just there is a debt, historical debt, that governments have for women. So they have taken from women the possibility to be autonomous, to be independent, and with a care system. So with this, we can show a lot of figures of how the care system that is not paid in some way. So we have huge gaps in the labor world, and the possibility of developing life systems. So to destine those funds for militarization and weapons to a system, a care system that women can develop their own life projects, not only life projects individually, but also life projects in a community level that generally feed a social network in the community that build peace and coexistence. Here, the third point, sorry, is the funding of the agenda of women, peace and security, is the resolution 1325, is the action plans. These action plans, many countries don't have enough funding. So if we destine this 10% to repair that lack or that gap that represents peace and security, we should obviously have an attention historical debt. So finally, we have the need to redistribution of those resources for the construction of a vision, of a perspective, not only a feminist security and an intersectional security. So we recognize here that we talk about an effect against women, we also differential impact in many indigenous women that have to see how their resources have been used, and so they are also product of the militarization. So black women in Colombia, they are women who, most of them are workers, and they are attending all the results of the wars and all the internal conflicts. So we have to build an agenda that not only builds on peace and also contributes to the truth and a restoration, security, and a no revictimization and of women. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Thank you so much. To all the speakers has been really a lot of food for thought. And now we're gonna move to this second part where finally we're gonna share the call. We're gonna read the text that we have come together in consensus with the coalition. Let me share the screen. So, the global military spending crisis. In 2024, the war spent an unprecedented $2.718 trillion on military budget, equivalent to the entire budgets of South Africa, Canada, Brazil, and India combined. This massive expenditure represents the highest military spending ever recorded, a 9.4% increase from 2023, surpassing even Cold War levels. Meanwhile, multiple simultaneous global crises persist. Hunger continues to claim millions of lives, the climate crisis intensifies, and human security remains fragile. The war also grapples with escalating refugee crisis, the rise of authoritarianism, and deepening global inequalities, all of which threaten the stability and well-being of societies worldwide. Our call, a 10% global reduction in military spending. We propose a simple yet transformative approach, a coordinated global 10% reduction in military expenditures. This is about redefining national security rather than weakening it. If every country reduces its military budget by 10%, no nation loses its relative defensive capabilities, but we collectively interrupt the endless and destructive arms race. A 10% cut will free up $271 billion annually, enough to end world hunger, cover half the required climate financing in the global south, and invest in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social welfare according to local needs. Communities around the world are struggling for this in their own context, regionally and globally. Our campaign can be a tool to amplify these struggles. We advocate for a strategic approach, building on regional and multilateral treaties on the way to a global treaty. Drawing inspiration from successful models like the nuclear weapons-free zone treaties, which include agreements across Latin America, the Caribbean, Oceania, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central Asia, we call for regional cooperative agreements, bilateral treaties between neighboring countries, and multilateral negotiations between existing international frameworks. These interim steps can create momentum, build trust, and demonstrate the feasibility of military spending reductions. We call not only for the divestment from military spending, but also investment in our futures locally and globally. We call for each country to invest half of the military spending saved into local social priorities and half into global social priorities. Repairing historical harm. The world's wealthiest nations bear a disproportionate responsibility for global military spending. In 2024, NATO members accounted for 55% of worldwide military expenditures, with the United States contributing 37% of global military expenditure. With shifting politics in the US, military spending continues to rise globally. Yet other funds, such as humanitarian and development aid and climate financing, are being cut back dramatically by many global North countries, furthering global inequality. A fair and equitable approach to security and resource allocation requires acknowledging these different shares of responsibility and taking concrete steps to redress the harm caused by excessive military spending, particularly in the most vulnerable countries and communities. Our call for allocating a percentage of each country's spending to global priorities seeks to address the inherent inequality between nations that contribute heavily to global militarism and those that contribute far less. Reimagining security, a divestment from harm for an investment in care. The current dominant militarized security model has failed. In 2024, 9 million people died from hunger, while over 233,000 died in armed conflict. Dominant perspective about security failed to address this insecurity caused by lacking access to land, food, healthcare, shelter, and employment. This type of insecurity is causing far more death and suffering than wars, while simultaneously exacerbating militarization and conflict. More weapons do not create more safety. True security means diplomatic solutions, non-violent conflict prevention and transformation, climate action, equitable land and territory rights, and investing in human well-being. A global movement, a shared vision. The 10% for all campaign is more than a policy proposal. It's a vision for renegotiating our collective futures. By working together across borders, exploring collaborative approaches, and building trust, we can create a world that prioritizes human life, environmental sustainability, and genuine security. Join us. Together, we can organize local and regional campaigns, highlighting the connections in our struggles to pressure decision makers, research regional cooperation opportunities, highlight the impact of military spending, and raise public awareness about security, alternative security approaches. Join us in bringing us all one step closer to a peaceful world. So this is the call that we are inviting all of you to sign. We invite you to add your name to these demands. And by signing on, you will help us amplify this message and demonstrate your support for reducing military spending, and especially for rethinking security and for investing in people and communities. Once you sign on, your organization names will be listed among the signatories, and you will start receiving updates and receive all the information about the campaign progress. We also invite you to join the 10% for All coalition. That is, if you have the capacity and the interest to support us in a more active way, there are several ways that you can get involved. Joining will mean that you will have a say in shaping the direction and strategy of the campaign. You will help us spread the word through your own networks and be part of the core work that drives this effort forward. We know that everyone's availability is different. We know everyone is trying to save the world in their own places, and that's okay. So that's why we have different levels of circles of engagement to make it flexible and for you possible to join. We have a coordinating committee that takes the lead on decisions and strategy. We have a coalition forum that meets online once a month, where we share updates, we make collective decisions. The members of this forum also work in creating materials for the campaign, in organizing events such as this one, and leading local actions. And finally, we have circles of allies and supporters, people and groups who stay informed and help us amplify the message and the campaign in their own spaces. So whether you can commit a lot of time or just a little, there is some space for you in this movement. What your partnership can look like beyond the level of commitment that you can offer, the way your organization contributes is entirely up to you. There are here, for example, some examples of some ways that partners are already supporting. So you're welcome to opt into one of these ones, or we are open to suggestions, and we would love to hear from you on other ways to be involved. So some examples are, for example, sharing content of the campaign in your social media, as well as incorporating some of the language and the message and the demands of the campaign into your own content. So you could also help us create the strategy for making our presence stronger and more effective. You can help us by thinking who else in your network could be involved, in what way. So you can help us with networking. You could help us organizing in your own context. That means, for example, coordinating or supporting a campaign in your own community, in your own town, or maybe initiate a national campaign. You can also contribute with research, with data, with case studies, or help us develop new reports and policy briefs on the different topics that we have been talking about. You can also help us by lobbying decision makers, signing onto joint statements, organizing public dialogues to help move our goals. Or you can help us also with fundraising. We need resources. You can help us identify potential donors, co-host fundraising events, or support directly the campaign with your own resources. So there's no one way to support us. There's no one approach. We are excited to work with you in whatever way makes sense for your own organization. So please, we invite you to join this growing campaign. Whether you can commit time, resources, or simple just help us spreading the word. Your support really makes a difference for us and for this campaign. So if you are interested in getting involved or have questions about how you could contribute, please reach out to us. We would love to connect, and we would love to explore how this could work for you. So these are the different ways that we imagine you could help us. But as I said, please reach out with other ideas. So I wanna thank all the speakers, but especially I wanna thank all the attendees for being here, for showing interest. Again, don't hesitate to reach out to us with your questions, with the ways ideas that you can have for this campaign. We have the email, we have the website. Please write to us, and we would love to hear from you. And let's keep working to make this campaign reality. And big thank you to everyone, and peace to everyone in the world.